Hi, it's Jan from youmakeitsimple.com, and today in this class tutorial I'm going to show you how easy it is to sew up baby burp cloths. As you can see, I've sewn up several different prints of these really quickly, easy to make, and these make really fun baby shower gifts. Let's get started. So to make your burp cloths, the items and things that you'll need are, of course, some fabric prints, some cotton fabric prints. You can also use knit, will work. Terry cloth, you can buy terry cloth by the yardage. I have found that buying, just going to Walmart or any kind of store and getting a really thin towels, terry towels work really well. You can get quite a few out of those. And you can also use, this is a more plush pattern, but it would make a nice cozy and absorbent burp cloth as well. So you can choose which option you want, and you'll just cut a pattern, fabric scissors, rotary cutter, a rotary ruler, pins, and of course the sewing machine. So you can just use your rotary cutter to cut out a 9.5 by 16.5 rectangle, but I like to just take a cereal box or cracker box. This is a cracker box, just so that it kind of weighs out and is easier to cut out, and I'll show you that in just a second. So just take your fabric, whichever you're going to use. This is the towel that I'm going to cut out. And of course you want to get rid of this edge. So I'm going to just place that on there. Not even going to use pins, just make sure it's flat. And of course you could use paper as well, make a paper pattern and pin it down. This, I just find this gets a really nice straight edge. So if I were to cut this, I might cut the cardboard. So I'm going to use my ruler and make sure that's right along the edge there. And that's that edge. Once you have your terry cloth pieces cut out, just stack them up and set them aside. And we'll get ready to cut out the print side of your burp cloth using your print fabric. So get your print fabric, and to make sure that you have a straight edge, especially if you're double folding the fabric, you want to make sure that you have a very straight fold, and so that it's not all ski-wampus, the cut. Take your salvaged edges and line them up. That's the finished side, and then the cut edge, usually if you just cut that from at the store, that's not going to be a straight edge. So line it up on your mat, and using a ruler, make sure that you're getting a square, straight edge to begin with. And from that straight edge, take your pattern piece and lay it on top. So I'm going to be cutting it on the fold, so we're going to get several pieces of this print at one cut. And use your ruler and cut all the way using the whole width of the fabric. That way you'll have a little piece on the fold to use for other projects. So see how I'm leaving the folded edge uncut, and I'm going to cut that and cut off the salvaged edge, which is usually a little white strip at the edge of your fabric, or there might be a little bit of writing or print on that salvage edge. You want to cut that off. And then you'll have two pieces of that particular print. So do that with however many pieces or prints that you want to cut out. Now to put it all together, we're going to take the terry cloth piece and put it down, and then the right side of the print will be facing down onto the terry cloth. Line up the edges and pin in place. To get your sewing machine ready to sew, if you're using a single needle machine, get the corresponding color of thread, set the stitch to a straight stitch, and the length 2 to 3. Wind a bobbin with the corresponding color of thread also. If you have a serger, use the serger. It will finish the seams and be a little bit quicker, but if you don't, no big deal. Single needle machine will be just fine. Take your burp cloth to the sewing machine and start in one of the corners, backstitch, and you'll be sewing a 1/4 inch seam allowance, sewing all the way down, and when you get to the corners, leave the needle in, lift up your presser foot and pivot the fabric. Sewing down all sides, you're going to leave the last short side halfway open to turn the fabric. And if you're applying a tag, this is a good place to put a tag. Just make sure it's even and sew the tag in. That's totally optional. Pivoting your seam and then only sewing down halfway, and then back stitching to leave an opening to turn it. If you're using the serger, sewing the same way, make sure you're pulling out your pin so you don't ruin your blade. When you get to the corners, just sew all the way off, lift up your presser foot, pivot it around, and start sewing the other side. It will leave a little chain of threads, a little stitching chain, but we'll just cut those off. Again, make sure you're moving your needles and only sew down halfway that last short side to leave a place to open. If you do have a serger, it makes it they usually sew a little bit quicker and they have a nice finished edge. But totally not necessary, and not necessary to finish the edges because we will be flipping it around and top stitching. With the single needle, you want to gently clip the corners, making sure you're not getting into the seam allowance, and turn it inside out. You can use the scissors to poke out the corners, and you'll want to use something, a dowel or a turning stick, something to make sure that those corners are poked out to make them square. And now we'll get ready to press them and sew the opening closed. Clip your threads. And to close that opening, we're just going to fold the seam allowance in and under, lining up with the edge there so that it is straight and even. Just work it with your fingers and then pin it in place. And we'll take it to the ironing board and press it. Do this with all your pieces. Now there's those little thread ends that we have with the serger, so just clip those if you want to. Turn it inside out and do the same thing. Just flipping, tucking, and folding the edge under, pinning it in place. So using your iron to press the edges, especially that opening closed. And you might have to kind of rub the fabric to make sure that it's totally open and the edges are straight. Pressing the seam allowance all the way to the edge. You kind of have to use your fingertips and roll the fabric. So I'm just kind of rolling that. Make sure you can tell. You can do both sides just to make sure that that is nice and pressed. So with that terry cloth, it kind of wants to stay rolled underneath, and so you kind of have to make sure that your seam allowance is all the way pulled out. Just make sure it's pinned in place. And now let's get ready to top stitch. So when you're top stitching, it's a good idea to use, if you want a really nice straight stitch, I find that using a sharp needle, 80-12 size, is a good thing. Sometimes it doesn't make a difference but on your machine, but if you find your stitch isn't really straight and nice, changing the needle really makes a big difference. So if you've got a nice straight stitch with a universal needle, that's just fine. Leave the needle in at the corners, pivot, and just make sure you're doing really, it depends on how far you want. I like to get close to the edge, maybe an 1/8 inch, at least a 1/4 inch, so that you're catching that seam allowance underneath, especially if you're using a single needle. Clip your threads, and we'll get ready to do the top stitching that will give you a nice fold. So to do that, we're going to sew just a couple stitches down through the fabric to give you a nice fold, measuring 5 1/4 inches from the edge. Both edges, both the top and the bottom, pin where that mark is, and we're going to use masking tape to give you a nice stitching line. Otherwise, it might get kind of skiwampus and it's hard to sew a straight line on a print like this. So just line up that masking tape with the edges of your pins to create a nice straight stitching line. I love using masking tape. I'm just going to sew along that edge. I leave the pin in so that I can remember which side of the tape to sew on. You're just going to back stitch and sew along that edge, and then back stitch. Back stitching, and then remove your tape. Clip your threads. Just about finished. There you go. So that just gives you, it keeps the fabric together almost like a little bit of a quilting, and then you can fold those in thirds and you have a nice cute folded burp cloth. Wasn't that a fun project? It's fun to get a fun collection of different colors depending on what you like or want to give. See you in the next class.